you can't just memorize 10,000 things and then be good to go. That's not like it's all about the problem solving skills. And I think one of the advantages that college gives is the ability to acquire a diversity of foundational knowledge about things.
Yeah. It gives I would say it gives you the opportunity to do that, but it doesn't make you do that, right? Because you still get to choose your path through.
Choices have consequences.
They absolutely do.
Yes.
Yep.
So if you're doing an evil playthrough of college,
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 432 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's September 8th, 20 Jubilee.
Ooh, it's the spooky one. It's the Wraith of September.
It's going to get cold at some point, probably. Not right. Apparently, it's 1 million degrees in many places, including the U.S. Open, where the players are turning into liquid puddles on the tennis court, apparently. So stay cool, everybody.
Stay cool.
Anyways, there's going to be profanity in this show, and we'd like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your monthly donations. Okay, let's get into it. What happened this week? First off, we played Baldur's Gate 3 multiplayer over the long weekend. Well, we only played it for a couple of hours. Thoughts? Adam, now this was Adam's first time playing it ever. And then Sam and I had already played it a shitload. Me, a slightly larger shitload. Assuming shitloads have variable sizes and it's not a standard unit of measurement. I'm not clear on that, but that's okay. So first off, I guess, Adam, I want to know your take coming into it totally fresh.
Yeah.
What was that like?
So I think this has some parallels also with Diablo multiplayer for my game playing experience. In that I think there's such a fundamental difference between playing with people, and not, and how that interplays with the game design is really interesting. So the struggle that I've always had in like the newer Diablo games is that it's kind of the sheer amount of like inventory stuff to look at, which is different from the inventory management problem, which I've talked about repeatedly how much I hate that. But it's actually just I want to like spend the time to look through all of the things, understand what's happening, right? But when I'm there with a group,
keep up.
I got to keep up with the group, right? And I find for me, like I just need like a slow plotting kind of gameplay experience when there's a lot of stuff like that to keep track of. And so my gameplay style tends to run into the like, well, I'll just like not even worry about any of this stuff and just like make sure I stay with the group, right? And so, which for like the newer, for both Diablo 3 and 4, when I would try to play with my wife, like, because she's like she can just understand what's happening way better than I can. Like
she's
at a glance, she's much more of a gamer than I am. And is just better at processing visual information. Like I'm just not good at that. I've got various deficiencies.
Slower on the uptake.
Yeah, I can't process visual information that well. So inevitably what always happens is like she's really into it and just like is blazing ahead. I'm kind of struggling to keep up. And then eventually I'm just like, I don't even like this anymore, And so the multiplayer in Baldur's Gate had kind of a similar vibe, but for a different reason, which was less about like inventory management and like that kind of thing. It was more like because the story can proceed without, or I guess the stories can proceed completely in my apps. Like I have no idea necessarily what's going on, right? So because we're also playing with my wife, who's all four of us. Everybody has played a bunch except for me. So they already knew who the characters were, and like kind of the overarching, like what's going on, knew who to talk to, kind of like to get a better gameplay experience, knew who to just kind of, in one case, just murder immediately,
who to kill and who not to kill.
Yeah, exactly. and I don't know why any of that stuff has happened, right? So when we first started, I was trying to like understand what was going on and trying to understand like the game mechanics and like what all the things do. But it was the same kind of deal as like playing Diablo where you
gotta keep up.
I got to keep up. And so I didn't even want to spend time like hovering over my little icons to figure out what the fuck the game controls are, And so I had to kind of quickly get into that mindset of like, okay, I'm just trying to I have to not care basically about the details so that I can just participate in the group social experience, right? And so it very quickly became like it just wasn't about the game, and it had to not be about the game for me to be able to play. So it was kind of just an interesting dynamic that for me repeats a lot because of my two-parter. One is I'm usually also last to pick up a game because I just don't play games that much. So I always have less context in a multiplayer setting and less practice, but also I'm just bad at visual processing, and so I'm just like slow at stuff.
You just need this is kind of the weird thing about multiplayer in a story game like this. And this was actually like a huge part of our conversation back when we were trying to figure out how to make Crashlands 2 a multiplayer game at the very start of development. We were talking through all the design implications of how do you take a narrative where you've got linear sequences of events where one thing leads to another, and have players that can dip in and dip out of that experience at unpredictable times, including, for example, those players having inventories that have specific special items in them that are important for the story or whatever. Like if those players can kind of disappear off the face of the earth at random, how do you do it? And also just stuff like, if Sam is over in continent A and I'm in continent B, but we're playing co-op and we're supposed to be progressing the story together and he starts talking to a character, how would I know what's going on in the story over there, right? Would we pause my game and teleport my camera all of a sudden, even though I might be like in the middle of a combat encounter? Do we, and so
do we just have
Baldur's
a shared
Gate,
journal? Like what? Yeah, what?
Yeah. So we never found a solution to that, and neither did Baldur's Gate. Actually,
No,
really.
yeah,
I think there isn't.
There isn't.
yeah.
Yeah, they just said, the experience is a fundamentally different one in a multiplayer.
It's just a different
context. Yeah, and so they basically made it so that everything can just happen for any one person, and it doesn't have to happen for everybody, right? Which is really neat in a few particular ways. Just in terms of like, if you want to go talk to someone, you don't have to like wait for a conversation to finish. You could just go talk. So you just go do your thing. No one is seeing the same stuff at all times. And so I guess it allows you to do a lot on a like per person basis. But I think to Adam's point, and I felt this too, I've spent most of my time just walking around as a badger, being a goofball and like just sort of jumping around because I didn't actually want to move stuff forward because
largely I wanted Adam to be the one moving things forward.
Yes.
because he hadn't seen it.
Yep.
And also like if somebody, so in Baldur's Gate, there's like a couple of kind of weird things that come from transitioning from single player to multiplayer. For me, kind of the big one is like, if you're playing single player, then it is an extremely methodical and well-paced experience because you yourself can do anything you want whenever you want to do it, and you can wait if you need to wait, right? So it's even the case where like if you hit escape in the game, it doesn't pause. Right. Like your characters, like things are still happening because it doesn't need to pause because
it's turn-based.
In general, it's turn-based, and there's like a few scenarios maybe where there's like a character that patrols around or something, and if they get too close to you, you'll enter into combat. But those are a bit more rare. It's more that like you have to interact with stuff, and then if you do get into a dangerous situation, it's a turn-based thing, and you have all the time in the world every turn to look at all the hundreds of spells you have and all the items you have, and also up to that point, you yourself will have picked up every single item. And so you will have looked at all the tooltips and you know all the stuff you have, right? Well, in multiplayer, you got 4 people independently running around, picking shit up, talking to people. They might be talking like there were a bunch. I kept trying to keep the group together, and I kept being like, all right, guys, we're getting split up. We're getting split up. Okay, let's get together, right? Because if, for example, somebody accidentally triggers a combat encounter in multiplayer and then the rest of the party is, hundreds of yards away off in the middle of a forest or something, then you got one person just getting absolutely wrecked in combat while everybody else is just running around.
Or in our case, if one of your players is a badger who weighs a lot and then falls through a floor, and then has an encounter then with 5 enemies underneath the floor while everybody else is still up topping, like what?
Yeah,
which was hilarious. I mean, that was
hilarious. Yeah. But yeah, so like I've read in the Baldur's Gate community, I've read a philosophy in there, which I think I'm starting to think is like pretty true, where they're like the real playthrough of this game is the second playthrough, because the first playthrough there's so many things and so many places and so many characters and items and mechanics and spells and, whatever.
It's just too much,
It's so much that but you can beat the game, of course, in your first playthrough, but you will have done so many weird and dumb things along the way or missed so many things because you're learning the whole time for 100 hours.
I think it's like D&D in general, right? It's like when you sit down for your first D&D campaign and people who GM those talk about the struggle of nobody knows anything. They take so long, in combat scenarios.
Yeah, people
so
flipping
fucking
through
long, right? Because everyone's trying to
they
figure
don't know
out
how spell slots work or
it's just there's enough complexity and not just complexity, but also just just details, right? That aren't even about complexity. It's just stuff that if you can't know it until you know it. But once you know it, then it makes a huge difference in the whole experience. And since Baldur's Gate is just that,
it's just D&D. It's just video game form. Yeah.
Then it just takes a lot of exposure to. I think the cool thing about it is that unlike in a tabletop D&D where you have to figure that stuff out by either having the GM or the table help you, right? Or you have to painstakingly read through a handbook and try to understand it in context, which is what I did when the last time I tried to play D&D. And it's not very interesting to read. I mean, anyone who's
and there's no feedback, right? So
exactly.
For example, one of the things that I never understood playing D&D was the concept of spell slots.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. And also, I've whenever I play D&D, I just play basic characters like a monk or something that doesn't actually use spells. I don't have to worry about it. And seeing the feedback of the UI in Baldur's Gate and what happens when you click on a spell, and do you want to upcast this? And I'm like, fuck yeah, I do. And then it's upcasting this means it'll use a higher level spell slot, but you can cast it on multiple targets now, or it'll do more damage now, right? So the tooltip changes as you upcast. But if you're trying to do that on a tabletop, you have to already know in advance all the details about what it means to upcast something, how that spell works, and you have to keep track on a piece of paper how many spell slots you have, blah, blah, blah. And it's there's no feedback. And so if you don't know it, you literally just can't do it. But in Baldur's Gate, you could just try to do a thing, and the UI is you can't do that. Or here's what'll happen when you do that, right? And so,
I definitely finally understand things about Dungeons and Dragons that I had never gotten to a point, even after playing. And we played for 6 months, I think, every other weekend or something like that.
Yeah, well, because the only way there's like Adam was saying, there's two ways to do it. One is to just play enough D&D with enough people that you sort of accrue that knowledge over time.
Yeah, or it's a hobby. Or you just watching. I think they call them real plays instead of let's plays. Yeah, you're watching Critical Role or Dimension 20, or any of the infinite resources out there for D&D.
It's option 1 is exposure, and option 2 is research, which is just read the player's handbook front to back multiple times and try to memorize everything. Which again is that's a huge onboarding problem.
I think it's interesting though about this is that. I was thinking as we headed into it because Baldur's Gate had multiplayer experientially that they somehow would have solved what I think is the core problem that we talk about in this context, which is essentially how do you keep everybody narratively and contextually on the same plane, right? In a narrative-driven game. And it was very funny to me to realize that their answer was simply, you don't. And then they just let you not.
Well, and I think it is similar to, and I think the reason that they can do that is because the D&D model already kind of takes all this into account, right? Which is when you're playing tabletop D&D, then the party can split, right? The party can go off and do different things. Because everyone's at the same table, though, but that's not even always true, right? Because especially these days, people will split over Discord, right? And separately talk to the GM, about what they're up to, so that they keep it secret, and then people choose what they actually disclose and stuff, right?
That's right. There's a lot of hidden knowledge basically gained throughout D&D as part of the
and it's basically because the world managed by the GM, right, is this autonomous thing that can be interacted with by anybody on the party, and there's not actually the idea of there isn't an idea of a main player character, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And I think the way that they solve the aspects of that don't work in a video game, I think they still solved the way that they had to, which is one of the things that we were debating back when we were thinking about Crashlands 2 multiplayer, right? Was how do players drop in and out? What does that part look like? And the way that they solved it is, as my understanding goes, is like you already have a 4-person party in the game as a single player experience, right? Where the members of your party are NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just said, okay, well, let's just replace each of those NPCs
with a person,
with a player character. But that means that you can't, but those characters are in the game world though, right? It's not
part of the story.
Yeah, they're part of the story. They're not portable. So if they have stuff on them that you need, in the same way that if your NPCs do, you just reach in their inventory and take it if they're not there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
I think it's that like the player characters will become NPCs that you can just keep in your party and do stuff with, even when that person is not there, or you can just have them wait in your camp. But either way, like that character is now just part of your game world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Whether that person is playing it or not, right. Which is it's a good solve for that.
Yeah.
Drop in and out problem.
Yeah. And it's like, if we would have done that, because in Crashlands 2, we were envisioning, we were trying to think about how to like solve these problems. We were like, well, ideally though, anybody could just pop in to your world and just kind of join you for a bit. Right. Mm-hmm. And while that's true, ideally from like a player perspective, that was so fundamentally incompatible with like making a game that could that the design would support that the end result was just like, nope, that's just not fundamentally possible, right?
I mean, in a lot of ways, I was thinking about this in the same vein as like destructible terrain in a weird way, which is like or like even destructible buildings, right? Like every now and then a game comes along and they advertise like this idea of destructible terrain, you could blow up and blow through everything in the environment, right? Which is cool. But if you look, for example, at the map of Baldur's Gate, like it's very strategically and specifically composed to guide you through things in certain ways or block access in certain ways. And as soon as you can, for example, just like destroy shit, and like if there's a wall in your way, you can just mow it down and go right through, right? Well, then suddenly you can't really do that in a narrative context. Right. So you can either have a pre-made story or destructible terrain, but not necessarily both. And I feel like we kind of landed on that with multiplayer and storytelling. But of course, like there are ways to combine them. And yeah, it's not perfect, right? Because of the problems of like multiple people going in different directions, talking to different NPCs, having different conversations, advancing the story in ways that the other people aren't aware of, right? Like there's all that kind of stuff. But I feel like they did about as good of a job with it as could be done.
Yeah.
I think so.
Like I think, was there a shared journal or something? Like I didn't actually see that part of the UI.
I believe the journal is completely shared.
Because I think if you have a mechanism to share inventory even when people are offline, and if you have a mechanism to
see the status
shared
of the
journal,
quests,
basically, see the status of quests.
Right. You basically get caught up on like, what's this? I don't even know what this is, but I guess it's a thing I got to go do by reading this little bit of text, Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the way that it just kind of has to work that way for a narrative.
Now, there's good.
Well, I say the main other consideration for us was basically the question at the heart of it was what is Crashlands, right? Because it's very easy to think about the multiplayer design for a kind of like a crafting sandbox game, right? There's a bajillion of those. There's a lot of ways to slice that.
Multiplayer in that game is just add more people.
Yeah, it's not particularly complicated in terms from a design standpoint and the repercussions there, right? But at the heart of it, I think is what we came down to is like if we, before we had the narrative systems in Crashlands 2, for example, it had more slapstick in it than the original did, and certainly far more humor, just like embodied humor, basically in the game world through the goofy creatures or whatever else than other, what you consider a crafting or survival game. But it didn't feel Crashlandsy until you get some jokes in there, until there's humorous text and humorous characters and weird shit going on, right? And so that was the really big hang up for us was like, okay, how do you, and I think this is still my question, which is rather than saying, okay, like Baldur's Gate, if you made a Crashlands 3 in the same vein as 1 and 2, just big narrative stuff, whatever, how do you put multiplayer in there in a way that's just like, sort of good? Kind of a different question was like, how would you translate the core of the RPG experience in something like Crashlands that has the humor and has the narrative? How would you actually translate it to work better and enable better multiplayer, like just sessions, right? Like how would you think?
Dude, I've been thinking about this so much because like something that makes it sort of obvious in Baldur's Gate is like you're saying even as a single player game, it's a multiplayer game,
Yes.
right? Because when you
You
play
already
as
have a
single
party.
player, you have a party of 4, and so it's already set up in advance to fairly easily allow, not easily, but like to have swapping in and out of party members, which could then become players,
Right.
right?
It's already also balanced around that, right?
Mhm.
Because
Balanced around
Exactly.
four,
you pick up your companions like really early on, but also at particular times of the story. But also they all started at low level, right? They're already kind of balanced in terms of their capabilities and stuff, right? So that they are doing different kinds of stuff. And then you get to choose as you go, like how to level them up, how to equip them, all of that kind of
Mhm.
stuff, right? And then all of the combat experiences are kind of designed around the idea that like
You got 4 people.
you've got 4 people, you've got a party, right?
Yep.
And that's why it works so, and I don't want to say seamlessly, but I think it does actually work really well. Like it's a
little more congruent, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's more
Yeah,
congruent.
well, and the fact that pacing wise, so if you think about like Crashlands, especially Crashlands 2 is a real-time combat, like a real-time action RPG, right? So it's not turn-based, and when you're fighting things in combat, you've got to be like doing stuff in real time and reacting and hitting buttons in response and dodging things, right? It's not about like a dice roll based on stats as to whether you take damage or not, right? And so the other kind of issue there is those kinds of combat encounters, once you add more people, become fairly trivial, right? Because like if the game is set up where it's like, all right, you're gonna like go out in the world and you're gonna like fight, you know, 1 or 2 of these creatures, blah blah blah. Well, what if you got 4 people with you? How do you not just become like a murdering?
Well, that's why in
lawnmower
so
death
many
squad,
multiplayer games or games that allow multiplayer, I guess, they just scale up the hit points on the thing, right? Or the damage it deals or whatever, or both, right? And so they just try to scale up sort of these fairly one-dimensional
just metrics, just like
metrics
that.
of
Right,
difficulty, right? So that when you then go encounter with a group, that it can be managed. But it's like, but unless the thing was designed for a group kind of experience in the first, because I think like this difference is like World of Warcraft dungeons, right? Which it's like that's designed for a group of people, and a lot of the way that they manage that is that they have like positioning, right? And like regions where a thing is going to happen and that kind of stuff, right? Because that's that way that you can make it so that it's designed around the fact that there's more than one.
You need
entity
X
there,
number
right?
of people.
Yeah.
You know.
And yeah.
But even in that game, they suffer from the single player versus multiplayer problem because like out in the open world, it's single player content in WoW. And the general consensus among pretty much everybody in the community is, wow, this open world content is boring as fuck, right? Like no matter what they do out in the open world, it's supposed to be stuff that's soloable.
By any one of these classes who might have any access to any one of these skills. So it's you can't
for the
really-
most part.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're like every now and then there might be some kind of like area that's designed for groups. But by and large, it's just like solo stuff. And this is within the same game, right? And so like
but this thing is you can't take a thing that's designed because like that means you have an enemy, say like a wolf, right? That can do a bite once every X seconds or whatever, right? Like that's its move.
And that's its whole thing.
And so one on one, like, okay, well, it's gonna bite you, right? Every chance it gets, and you can then balance the parameters around that, right? But if it's that wolf versus 4 people, well, okay.
The wolf is dead in 1.3 seconds.
But also, but it can only bite. It can still only bite one person, right? So like it can really only meaningfully like then go after one person. Everybody else is then just going to deal damage to it. It's a completely different kind of encounter and different kind of experience because it doesn't meaningfully scale past one on one, right? At all. And like any time you have like any kind of combat experience that's based on that. And I think this is why, like, again, like those like World of Warcraft dungeons are good because like there's a reason that so much magic is happening because you can use magic to attack multiple people at once without having to explain anything, right? And it scales really well, right? Because you just like whatever, it's just like 3/4 of the area is on fire or whatever, right? But if you're having like melee combat or anything like they just don't scale. And I think that's the advantage that I think Baldur's Gate has for this is that they already designed every part of the experience around having a party of 4.
Yeah.
Right. And kind of optionally, because like you don't necessarily have to have everybody, that kind of stuff, right? But it's still all designed around that expectation. And so even when like most individual parts of an encounter are one-on-one. An encounter, though, is against a group, right? And it's all about like positioning to create several one-on-one or similar kinds of scale encounters, right? So that you can scale the whole thing based on just how you design an overarching encounter with multiple enemies versus like a standard crafting game where it's the normal experience is one-on-one. That's actually what it is, right?
I almost think you'd have to go with like almost like a lobby based, or not even like a lobby based, but like that roughly that equivalent thing to be able to integrate these really challenging design parameters together. So think about like you know how like Hades merges the narrative complexity with like a roguelike, right? The way they're able to do that is by having that home base that's essentially this pocket where there's characters doing stuff, right? And they're able to then very easily control and drip feed stuff out through that context. I feel like you could theoretically find some kind of loop that was everybody kind of in a place, and then you choose to go out on a like gathering mission or a quest thing, and then it's like, so you almost have like more of a mission structure attached to it, but you wouldn't have like an open world.
It's essentially it's the idea of like a WoW dungeon, right? Like
that's
you do stuff solo in the game, and then then there are multiplayer things in the game, and then you like get together with your friends and go do that thing, but it's not the whole game that is intended to be a multiplayer experience, right? So but it was, I mean, my recommendation, I think, if anybody's looking to pick up Baldur's Gate 3 and try the multiplayer stuff, I think it's worth it to just do your own playthrough first.
Yes. I think you actually should, because I think to Adam's point, there's too
Learn
much
the
pressure
game.
Otherwise to
or play with a group of complete noobs, right? Because that way you can help each other figure out what's going on and all that kind of stuff without somebody just already knowing. Because I think that asymmetry is what creates the
But,
like
but
it's still fun, right? But it is a different kind of a gameplay experience if you're the one who doesn't know anything, right? And everybody else knows what
I
they're
think
doing.
the problem is, even if you got all 4 people who don't know anything coming in, because of the fact that things can happen without your knowledge, like people picking up items or people having conversations or whatever, unless you're really paying attention, which is you can only really do if you already are familiar with the game, right?
Because you don't even know what to pay attention to otherwise.
Yeah. Then I do think that a full multiplayer playthrough in the first go I might be okay with like 2 people, because like that's you can coordinate with that one person.
4,
right?
I wouldn't do 4.
4, it's just like it's a herding cats problem. Yep. Like people are just off doing their own shit all over the place, right? And if you're not really focused on what's happening, then you'll just miss.
Well, it's even something as simple as just like what should happen with loot, right? Like I couldn't even have an opinion on because I didn't know like.
You didn't have time to read all the tooltips and be like, what even are these?
Yeah,
things?
like how many kinds of loot are, like every once in a while somebody would be like, does anybody need a short bow? And I'd be like, well, I already have one. Is there only one kind of short bow? I have no idea, right?
How does loot even work?
Is the answer obviously yes or obviously no, or is there subtlety here that I have to kind of work out? Like I have no idea, you know.
Or do we need a long bow or like a venti bow or a grande bow? I don't know.
How does this all work?
How does it work? Yeah, so it was interesting. I was curious to hear your thoughts, Adam, on that, of like totally blind first playthrough. But maybe someday you'll play through some of the campaign, and then we can do a new playthrough as a group. And
again, like I still had fun. It's just a different kind of experience than like
it's very different.
Truly getting to just get into the game, you know.
It's sort of a what the fuck is happening, everything is on fire kind of fun, as opposed to the strategic decision making fun of the single player mode.
And I think there's like if you just want to like hang out with some buddies and like have some cocktails and just like have a hilarious good time, even if there's asymmetry in that group, or if everybody knows what they're doing or nobody knows what they're doing. Like if you come into it just being like, we're going into chaos, we're not going to know what's happening, but
there's no plan here.
There's no plan, but the moment to moment interactions are going to be like fun and interesting, right?
Yeah, that's definitely good for that.
Yeah, it'll definitely be good for that.
Yeah, and I will just to kind of cap off this convo, I do want to briefly tell the story of what happened with Sam's owl bear. So here's the deal. So like we were saying, when you're talking to somebody in conversation, normally in single player in Baldur's Gate, you're in a cutscene, and your party members do not do anything during that. They're just waiting for you to finish the conversation, right? And sometimes they're part of the conversation. Well, in multiplayer, it's not like that. People can optionally listen into your conversation and watch the cutscene, or they can just keep doing whatever they're doing. So,
But it's actually, you can tell like it is neat like from a tech standpoint. And again, they made a whole bunch of decisions that made all of this work. And I don't know how much of that was the initial design and they got lucky, or if it was all designed for multiplayer from the start. But all of the cutscenes take place in the game world, right?
Yes.
With like the in-game camera and all that kind of stuff, right? So that it can accommodate all the kinds of variations and things that can happen, but that also includes the fact that there could be other real human player characters
wandering around.
So yeah, you actually see them in the back of the shot, which is hilarious.
just walking around. Yeah. So we get into these, and this, I'm not going to consider this a spoiler because this is like in the first 15 minutes of the game. Yeah. Okay. So we get into these ruins, and there's these looters in there, and it's like a, ruin, like a temple or something. Yeah. So there's like all kinds of broken shit and like boards and rocks everywhere and stuff. And so we get into these ruins, and there's these looters in there, and they're immediately antagonistic because they think that we're coming after the same loot that they are coming after. Right. So I'm like, no problem. Well, like I'm in here talking to this person. I'm like, yeah, I'll just kind of talk my way out of this so we don't have to fight these guys. So having this conversation. Meanwhile, Sam is transformed into a bear or something, and I just see him kind of wandering around.
I'm just slinking around in the background.
In the background, he's in sneak mode, and maybe he's thinking like, I'm going to get set up. I'm going to position myself so that when this combat encounter starts, I'm ready to maul some people. Right. Well, turns out there's a patch of floor that's made of like cracked boards that if something heavy enough goes onto it,
something
it
like
break,
a bear,
which I didn't know because like I had walked over that ground many times in this playthrough and prior playthroughs. I didn't know that there was a weight limit on those boards, but there is. So I'm mid conversation talking to this guy, and suddenly I hear just like this explosion of shattering wood. And Sam just yells like, "What the fuck?" And then all of a sudden,
the floor.
Sam is gone. He falls through the floor as a bear, lands, takes some fall damage, and is like knocked. He's like prone down below. The people upstairs that we're talking to suddenly get startled by this. It's possible that Sam took one of them with him through the floor. I'm not sure, but either way, it was interpreted as a hostile action.
It's fair.
So Adam and Jenny and I are upstairs now trying to fight these guys, and Sam is downstairs fighting more people as a bear, and Sam's screaming like, "Guys, you got to get down here and help me." And we're like, we literally can't. Like, we're being attacked up here. So eventually we had to just kind of let Sam get killed so we could clean up upstairs, and then we jumped down the hole and used a scroll of revivify on him to get him back up, and then we fought the guys downstairs, right? But it's just like that amount of, you don't really have to fully know what's going on to appreciate just how fucking dumb and hilarious
it was great.
That kind of a thing.
Yeah, the degree to which the game accommodates what the players are doing,
that was shocking,
to make it interesting is, and especially in combination with the fact that it's a heavy story driven game, right? Like it's designed to have certain kinds of, and like every part of the design like has a large set of outcomes they've actually sort of sorted out for you, right? But they're still responsive, just kind of in general, to stuff that happens in the world, and it all just kind of works, which is it's a remarkable feat.
Yeah,
and even when things don't work, they often don't work in ways that are still consequential and kind of hilarious. Yeah. So like.
Well, and the game lets you, like, you're allowed to just make it so that the game is impossible to beat, right? Like, you can kill off things that people you're not supposed to, right? And like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it too.
You could technically kill all the companions. Like, you could go through the game and never have a party because you've killed every person who wanted to party with you. Like, you'll have a really, really hard time. And I've even seen a lot of people who are actually kind of upset because people talk about the idea of doing an evil playthrough, where they're like, I'm going to make all the decisions that like harms the most people, right? But then they're like, this game doesn't properly support an evil playthrough because I keep ending up with no companions, right? And I'm like, no, it seems like it is supporting it, right? Because like, the only solution would be to have an entire suite of pure evil companions who are available for you to recruit, who won't leave you or get upset or whatever
That's
when you're like
horrific shit.
genociding and doing all kinds of horrible stuff, right? But it's also just stuff like so many of the choices that you can make will result in villages being destroyed or whatever. And like all of the characters in there are gone now. And those characters may have had important things to do later in the game.
Yeah,
and
it's
you just
just
can't
gone
do
now.
those
Yep.
things, right? And it's like, yeah, that is the consequence of being a piece of shit, right? Like
Yep.
it seems like the game is doing
correct,
what
actually.
it promises.
Well, I
which
think,
is
I think
like,
they
hey,
did the interesting
actions have
thing.
consequences.
Yeah, well, as they made it so that stuff is really dynamic in terms of how it handles, how every part of the game handles context, right? So like it can take into account lots of stuff, and then they just make it so that you're allowed to violate their intended pathways, right? Because the game is dynamic enough that it responds in some way to that, whatever it is, right? But it just becomes your fault, you know? Like it's what,
Yeah,
just like you're saying,
you
like,
did that.
yeah, you shouldn't have. It was kind of like, yeah, yesterday I was laughing because this is a little bit of a tangent, but I was working on my Stitch for VS Code thing, Game Maker editing in VS Code. And I was trying to figure out why I was trying to open this test project I was working on. And it just like was giving me just weird fucking behavior. And I just couldn't figure it out what was going on. And I realized it was because I just had two projects with the same name. And it was something I hadn't accounted for in the logic, right? So that there was this basically just every time requests were coming through, it's like randomly being routed to one project or the other one kind of a thing. It was just very weird behavior. And for a second, I was like, oh, I guess I need to fix this, until I came up to the next conclusion, which was, no, I just shouldn't have done that. I just shouldn't have opened two projects with the same name. And I think this is that same kind of a deal where they were just like, you're allowed to do whatever, right? But they're just, there's things you shouldn't do, though. And I think the cool thing about the design of the game is that they just let you ruin the game for yourself, right? They just let you do that while simultaneously making it so that when you've done that, it's obviously your fault, right? But also the way that the game gets ruined is not that the gameplay experience somehow breaks. Like characters aren't saying weird random stuff or whatever, right? It's that just things that you needed to happen can't happen, and so they don't, right? Or characters don't have the appropriate triggers to go through the line of things, but the character's still there. They still do other stuff, right? They just don't do the stuff that you would have actually needed them to do. So I think it's a really interesting way that they've paired all of these design ideas together to make it so you can have this dynamic of a multiplayerable or single playerable experience, right? All that still allows for that degree of like flexibility is just, again,
It's crazy.
it's a very impressive technical achievement. I guess actually design.
both
It's
technical-
it's a design achievement. That's actually really impressive.
Yeah, for real.
But it's got to be technical as well, because even thinking about like, I think just at the end of the day yesterday, Sam and I were talking about this little like quest sort of chain in the game where it comes in Act 1, but then
In Baldur's Gate
so
or
I'm-
Crashlands?
in Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 3. And like in my first playthrough, a set of things had happened during this encounter where this sort of evil character teleported away as I was about to defeat her. And then in Act 3, that character reappeared with a whole different story and like a whole different quest, like some other bullshit they had gotten up to in the meantime. And now I was supposed to try to stop them again, right? And then in my second playthrough, I managed to find a way to actually kill this character in a way that prevented her from teleporting out at the beginning, or like teleporting away during the combat encounter. And now I'm like, what's going to happen now? Like, cause what I don't know is like, I basically shoved her down a hole, right? Which is a great way to kill lots of things in Baldur's Gate. You just push people off of things. And I'm thinking like, did she die though? Like,
Yeah, who knows?
is she still going to be there in Act 3, or is she, cause like there's plenty of people, who I thought were going to be in Act 3, but ended up not being because of some decisions that I made earlier that I found out later. Oh yeah, whoops, I fucked that up, and this person never showed up again, right? And so I assume it's going to work the other way. We're like, I defeated this person when normally they would escape, so now there's a quest chain later that I'm never going to actually get to do. Right? So, but yeah, actions have consequences in a pretty spectacular way, honestly.
That's great.
So, all right, you guys want to get into one or two questions?
Sure.
All right, these questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net. Highest upvoted question comes from FantasmicGalaxy, who says, "Hey bros, given that you all have largely taught yourselves the skills needed to run a game studio, what are your thoughts on the costs and benefits of a college education versus learning on your own? Any useful college-related whiz nugs? I'm starting the second year of my comp sci degree in a couple weeks.
We have hit questions like this over the years, so I don't know if our answers hold up, but it might be worth also perusing the archives and seeing if you can get some more answers out of there. But I think in general, we've kind of all landed in the same place, which is college has a purpose, and we're all glad we did it. And there are certain things that I know for myself that there are certain things that I got out of it that like I couldn't have gotten any other way. It set me on the path that I needed. And there were a lot of things that I really learned. All of that said, college wasn't really what taught me how to do anything.
College teaches you about things.
Well, it depends.
Well,
that's the thing is it depends on the courses, and it depends on the degree program, and like so much of it depends, right? And I think the problem is that so much of college is an extension of like your early education, where like you're saying, Seth, like they're teaching you about stuff.
They're teaching you about physics or about business.
Yeah,
but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can do those things.
Yeah, because it's largely kind of theoretical, and even when it's not, it's very prescriptive, right? It's just like, oh, this is how this works, Like anytime I've heard a fresh out of college person talking about anything, it's just so fucking prescriptive. Right? It's just like, yeah, this is how it works. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. And the reality is just like definitions of words. You need to treat them descriptively and not prescriptively, meaning like people are trying to summarize things. Like a definition of a word is not what the word means. It's a summary of the people who wrote the dictionary's understanding of how people use that word, right? And similarly, when you go to college and you learn about like these frameworks for how to understand stuff and like what the rules are and like how these things work, those aren't actually how they work. Those aren't prescriptive. Those are descriptive of like our current understanding.
Right. What you're saying is the dictionary people don't decide what words mean.
Yeah. They describe what it seems like people think words mean, right? And yes, and college is the same. Like it's the same deal. And I think the problem is that, again, depending on all the details of like your particular program and stuff. Because for me, it was like, I went to a really challenging college and took really challenging courses and stuff that I was interested in. And took it, but it wasn't until like my advanced courses in those things where the distinction between prescriptive versus descriptive, and between like this is how it works versus like we actually don't know how it works, but here are the tools that we use to try to figure out how things work, right?
Yeah, we just told you that stuff earlier because
you needed a foundation of things.
Yeah, it's useful.
Yeah, well, because otherwise you can't even talk about it, right? Like, if you don't know about the details of like the components of a cell is sort of how we understand it, you can't talk about cell biology, right? You can't get into that next phase of like, how do we know this though? Like, where does this actually come from? How do we figure this stuff out? And so for me, it wasn't until later college and then in particular grad school where that distinction between prescriptive and descriptive became strong enough that I was actually truly getting utility out of like the education program. And it was because the ability to understand that made it so that the details of like what I was doing kind of became irrelevant. It didn't actually matter that I was like learning non-transferable skills, right? Like I got really good at pipetting tiny volumes of liquids, and designing how to manage a 364 well microplate so that I could put tiny numbers of cells in each one and have them grow at the same rate by carefully controlling temperatures, right? Like, how many times do you think I've used that since then? Or like I also got good at pulling ovaries out of fruit flies, Again,
very niche skill.
How often do I use that, right? But I got to still leave those experiences with a deeper fundamental understanding of how to tackle problems, right? And I think that's the kind of, to me, that's kind of the issue with like what any kind of general purpose course-based kind of knowledge track is that it can either teach you how to think about stuff and how to solve problems in the general sense, or it can teach you about some problem, right?
Yeah.
And the quicker you can get into not the about the problem, but like how problems are solved. That's where you actually can get the real value out of things, because otherwise the fact is like the details, because prescriptive details are always wrong and they're always low on nuance and they're always outdated, then if that's the kind of information you're trying to get, then you're going to need you need to go to where the most current versions of that are, which is not college, right? Those are always behind, especially in comp sci and programming, all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, you can't just memorize 10,000 things and then be good to go. That's not like it's all about the problem solving skills. And I think one of the advantages that college gives is the ability to acquire a diversity of foundational knowledge about things.
Yeah, it gives I would say it gives you the opportunity to do that, but it doesn't make you do that, right? Because you still get to choose your path through.
Choices have consequences.
They absolutely do. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So if you're doing an evil playthrough of college, it's going to be a little different, and you probably won't graduate because everybody's dead. But so I think for me, the stuff that really kind of helped me the most was the fact that I couldn't settle on a major, and I just kept changing majors and like taking a whole bunch of different courses. And now I program all day, and I did not do that in college. I was not a computer science student.
Same.
But programming is a problem-solving tool. And what I learned from all the stuff I did in college was how to think about and work through big, complex problems and how to break them down. And that came from doing case studies in my finance courses and my economics courses.
It was basically modeling the real world, right, is what you were focusing on in these different disciplines, but it was modeling the real world, which is, as you're saying, what programming is, right? Or I guess a fake world, because both economics and game programming,
it's all just models.
It's all just lies. It's all just made up lies about the world. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got really good at lying about the world and then pretending like a bunch of things that matter don't actually matter. You know?
But you got good at figuring out the consequences of arbitrary rule sets, right? And so whether it's economics, where we make up a whole bunch of, again, fake rules about principles about how the world works and then see the outcome, and that's what we call economics, right? It's the same deal in making video games, is you make a whole bunch of rules about like what the interactions are like, what happens when things do things or whatever, right? And you figure out the consequences of that. And that skill set of like understanding and choosing prescriptive rules, right? And understanding their consequences. Like you can take that anywhere, make games, write books, do whatever.
I'll never forget one time when we were doing a game jam, we were making Torso Demon Saga. And Sam's buddy was with us doing the jam. And he's a physics guy, right? Or engineering.
He works on drones, so he's a controls engineer.
Yeah, very deep knowledge in lots of domains of like material science and mathematics and physics and engineering, right? And in this game, we had a mechanic where like you have two characters that are stuck together by a stretchy rope, and as you walk apart from each other, the rope tightens, and at a certain point, you can't pull the rope anymore, right? So you're kind of like tethered together. And as we were talking through this, he's like, all right, I'm going to figure out this rope thing. I'm going to figure out the rope mechanics, right? And so he goes out and he starts researching like tensile strength of ropes and different kinds of materials and blah, blah, blah.
Physically model it,
And so he's off doing this for like 3 hours. And meanwhile, like that's the core mechanic of the game. And I had to get something in there.
Gotta be in there,
so that we could start working on the game. And so I was like, well, I'll just do this. Like, I'll just do this formula. And it was a little bit weird. So I just divided it by 2 and then, it felt great.
It's the idea of the magic number, right? Which is like in programming where you have a number where the number itself doesn't mean anything. It just needs to be that number for everything to make sense. Yep.
And it just works, once you do that. And so after a while he came back and he's like, okay, here's what we're going to do with it. I'm like, yeah, don't worry about it. I just divided it by 2 and then we're good to go. Right. And so we played it and he's like, oh yeah, wow, that was really unnecessary. All that stuff I did, right? Yeah. And it's like, it's like one of the skills that I was able to pick up, through college was that idea of like not actually worrying about what's real.
Yeah.
And what like how things actually work or how they quote should work. And it's just like the should is that the game should be fun. And it should exist. And so whatever gets us there the quickest, we just do that. Right. So, Yeah, so those are the kinds of things that you can.
Which is
you know,
unfortunately, not to keep shitting on economics as a discipline, but that's unfortunately also how economics works, where it's not about whether it's right, it's about whether
It's
it
just
feels
not real.
good,
Mm-hmm.
Man, I saw this article this week about the GDP gap between Europe and the US.
Oh my God, who cares? Because it's the
Which is-
GDP. It's the most one-dimensional, useless fucking metric.
Yeah, well, in this article they were talking. It was like a doomsday thing about
I
like,
know.
oh my
It's
god,
so-
like
I hate it.
Europe's GDP is collapsing. Like Europe is fucked. Meanwhile, the US has like we have a concept of medical bankruptcy. Like we've got our life expectancy keeps going down
Yeah.
year over year, right? And
We
like
have
there's
the
all
worst childbirth mortality rate, maternal
Yeah, and it's like,
mortality rate. Like,
yeah, it's like, all right, what does GDP measure? It measures like
how much money rich people have. That's what
how much money are we moving around?
Yeah.
That's the whole fucking thing. And so then, at no point in this article was there any kind of like, but does this matter? No, that never came up, Yeah. So economics isn't real. It's all just a bunch of made up numbers. So, which happens to work very well for games.
Does.
So-
Yeah. It turned out to be fun.
So I guess my advice would be go get a degree in economics.
Yeah,
It's useful.
It's the idea of like prescriptive versus descriptive, right? And trying to figure out how do you think about what it means to model a system. And I think that because that's what it really what's what problem solving is in general, right? It's trying to figure out, okay, how do I actually describe and the description of a problem is a model, right? And it's always a simplified version of the real problem because there's no way. It's literally impossible, philosophically impossible to fully articulate a problem, right? As in like literally proven. It's literally proven you can't do it, right? It's just not possible. So
there's
everything
that-
you do is model based. And I think if like that's the skill set that makes you able to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of a while back we talked about that chaos book where they talked about how like if you can't even predict the weather because if you put a sensor every 100 feet and make a grid of sensors all around the entire world, right? Then all you're doing is you're measuring the atmospheric pressure, blah, 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 at ground level in 100-foot intervals. And anything could be happening in between those sensors.
And
but you
and
can't
above
measure
them.
that. And above them.
And also all
if-
the sensors are probably placed on like buildings and shit, right? So what you're actually measuring is what happens on top of buildings.
Right. You're measuring all kinds of
You
random
know?
shit you didn't want to be measuring. And then also like if you're like, well, let's just add more sensors. Well, the more sensors you add, now the sensors themselves start to disrupt the flow of the air and other shit. And then you can't predict the effects of that either, right?
And you also have
Which
to
is
learn
why,
about the
like-
variation between sensor readings and what that means. Like how much of that is real? How do you know if a sensor is behaving correctly, right?
Right.
Yeah.
There's also that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is why, like, you can look at the weather forecast and they'll be like, all right, in 3 hours, there's a 30% chance of fog, right? It's like, I don't know. Like, this is
My favorite
But
is
they're-
when
but they're also
it
telling you
says
that-
it's raining, and then you go outside, it's not raining.
Yeah,
it's not raining. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're also
it's a guess.
because they're also trying to summarize the weather, which is again that's a made up concept, right? Because like the weather is basically what's happening in the column of air above your head. That's your experience of the weather, right? But the weather with a capital W, as we talk about it, right, is like it's
an
something that
abstraction.
it's an abstraction that's again a model that then the outcome of the model is passed on to large groups of people where the goal is for it to be sufficiently accurate
That has utility.
that scale that it's useful, but that we don't have to go smaller because it costs more and more and more and more to get accurate at those smaller scales, right? And so so your experience of like what the weather app says, right, is always just always
Mileage
off.
may vary.
Yeah, mileage may vary, right? Because like nothing, the only thing measuring the column air above your head is your own body moving through these columns, right? And that's it.
Otherwise, but yeah, the models are useful.
I want to put a
they're not
plug
real,
in
but
for
useful.
underwater basket weaving real quick because it's a thing that if you haven't heard it, it's a very common, like basically
It's a conservative.
it's a saying about uselessness in college, right? About the idea that learning stuff is useless, right?
Or that you should only learn things that you can turn into a labor skill that you can sell on the labor market for a high price.
Yes.
more specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, things that have a theoretical application but not an application currently, or that very clearly do not have a theoretical application even. So,
But even there, because even though that, because what you're still talking about is like to sell that in the right, because like most of the things that we even sell, like the application is in the fact that you can sell it. That's the whole that's the whole thing, right? So it's actually not about utility. It's not about any of that kind of stuff, right? It's just about like, can you make money doing that?
Like crypto.
Yeah, like crypto.
Yep.
So an interesting thing about, like we said, economics, for example, or even this comp sci stuff, is that the reality is that coming out of college, you will be ill-equipped, no matter what, to do whatever specific thing you're going to do next. Just sort of contextually, it's just not possible for college to do what it claims to be doing in most cases, which is to prepare you, right, for...
Yeah, because you won't have experience doing the thing.
Yeah. And again,
until you've done it for a while.
And the thing is very different depending specifically on where you are at, who you are with when you're doing that thing. So even if you're programming, you're like, okay, I'm a CS major, I have a programming degree. If you go between, say, 4 different possible different companies after you graduate, the whole stack of stuff they use there, the bosses you interact with, the coworkers you interact with, it's everything is so,
what they expect you to know. Yeah,
exactly. It's so different every single time that, dare I say, you may have spent your time just underwater basket weaving and had a similarly distant gap between you and the reality that's ahead of you, right?
Yeah,
because
if you used underwater basket weaving as a way to like think about the philosophy of how to solve problems, right?
Exactly.
Then yeah,
because
again, also would have instead taken computer science as a way to like learn computer science, but not as a way to think about these more abstract, higher level problems. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
because the thing you learn specifically doesn't matter. Actually, it's the
and
approach
that's
to
the
learning.
important note. Everything is underwater basket weaving in college. Everything. Because the reality is that what you have to take away from it is the same thing you would have to take away from an activity like that in order for it to be useful to you as a person, which is to say that how does one solve the problem of getting to a certain depth and weaving a basket at that depth without running out of air before coming up? Okay. That's some complicated
and also,
shit.
what happens? What's the material properties of the things that you're trying to weave?
Yeah, what
underwater, right?
What can you weave under there?
Yeah,
And
because
how
some
do you
things
get
will be
it
trying to
down?
float. Yeah, because like think about if you're trying to weave like those big pool noodles underwater.
Exactly.
Interesting
I'm saying,
engineering problem. How the fuck do
this
you
is
do that?
an exceptionally challenging problem. And so when you actually think about it for 2 seconds, I think you can recognize that at its abstraction, something like that, it has the same shit in it as every other one of these things does. And it's all kind of made up, and it will all be basically useless to you when you try to leave. So, take the approach of learning how to do stuff broadly so that when you get out, the new stuff.
This is also why I always say that for most people, their approach to data analysis, they might as well just use a horoscope instead. They might as well use astrology, right? For exactly the same reason, which is like people they're like, oh, well, it's data analysis, therefore it's like, I get this idea of like it's not underwater basket weaving, right? Like it's worth something, right? When the reality is like it fucking depends, right? Because most people's understanding and capability around data analysis makes it so that the results aren't any better than you would get from just fucking doing whatever you want instead, right?
Yeah.
And
read some chicken bones. I don't know.
Yeah, and so kind of categorically being like, this is good, this is bad, whatever. Because the reality is like just data analysis is the same. You're good at it if you understand what you're modeling and how well your model reflects the thing that you're trying to understand, and then how to convert all of this information into that model, right? That's what it's all the same shit all over and over again. But the thing that actually matters is not the details of the problem. It's your ability to go after a problem. That's always the thing that matters.
So now I'm imagining a college course called underwater basket weaving, where literally all they just do on the first day, instead of a syllabus, they just give you a job. And they're like, by the end of this semester, you need to have woven a basket underwater. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to give you any guidance at all on how the fuck you even do that. Because like you're saying, Sam, the stack of problems you suddenly need to figure out how to solve is actually enormous.
Yeah.
Where even is the water? Where can I get
what's a basket?
What counts as a basket?
Yeah, what counts as a basket?
What counts as a basket? How do I even weave any basket in any context, let alone
once I'm
fucking
underwater.
underwater.
Yep. Is
Like
like
you
a free
said,
diving
what's
situation?
it made of?
How do I make it so I can hold my breath for 7 minutes so I can finish
Do I
a
need
whole
to get
fucking
scuba
basket?
certified? like do I need to be underwater, or can I just
Have your hands underwater.
Can I just have the Like
Can a
there's all
robot
these.
do it underwater?
Ooh,
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah.
Does it even have to be water, or does any liquid count?
Just a submerged basket. Yeah. So like there's this kind of stack of problems and questions that like you would have to kind of use your own discretion and judgment to talk through and figure out and like compare notes and do research and whatever. And honestly, like going through a semester with a class like that would actually probably be one of the more transformative experiences of college.
One of the most transformative for me was this class I took my freshman year where we just sat in a circle and talked about literally random shit that happened to people. You just talk about it. And it was like boring
talking
as fuck
about them
90% of the time. Yeah. And then otherwise you're digging into assumptions and stuff like that. And it's like,
exactly.
You know, people look at those, were those like egg engineering competitions and stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do this in college. They do this in high school. And
like drop an egg from X height without breaking it, or
it always has this air of like it's a competition. It's like engineering, you know, like it's gonna be useful. It's underwater basket weaving. It's all the same. It's just the same damn thing. It's like hey, don't drop an egg.
Yep.
Just don't do that. And then you don't have to worry about engineering an insanely complicated solution to keep it from breaking.
It doesn't matter. It's not about the thing. It's just about the approach.
It's not about the thing. Yeah. So as long as you approach college that way, you're be good. No, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you're taking the approach of trying to extract the problem solving and critical thinking aspects of all of the courses that you take.
And having said all that, if the stuff that you think you want to do as a career, right? If you can take courses related to that and you're approaching it in this way, right?
Oh yeah.
Then that's what's going to give you a head start. Yeah. Because for in any discipline, there's a million things that you have to just also know. And again, this is still about modeling, right? Because like if you go into solve programming problems, it's not sufficient to be able to convert a problem into a series of like, okay, well, if I do this, and this, here's my algorithm, right? Then I'm good. Because you also have to understand like how underlying programming languages do things, because that actually gives you the toolkit that tells you how you even can break the problem apart in the first place, right? So either one of these is a head start, whether you like know a whole bunch about that or whether you're just really good at problem solving, right? Both those are a head start. But the one that matters more is modeling. And if you put those things together, that's the thing that actually truly sets you apart, but more importantly, sets you on a course where you can just have a good time being really good at solving problems that are interesting to you, and that hopefully somebody will pay you to solve.
Yeah, and most importantly, once somebody asks you what you do for a living, you can say modeling.
Oh, there you go.
Ooh, yeah. Become a model.
And then they look at you and they're like, really? And you're like, no further questions, please.
Like, yeah, I spent at least a few hours modeling. You know?
That's right. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this episode. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. And as always, please head on over to Steam to give Crashlands 2 a wish list if you haven't done so already. It helps juice up the algorithm and gets us more visibility on the game, and we really appreciate it. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.